welcome to From the Files of Dr. Mac, hosted by J.J. McCollister. The heritage portion of interests, Blacks in the Bible, Her Story, includes women in the Bible, prominent issues which can be handled with biblical Christian counseling, as well as comments regarding current media content regarding women. And now, Dr. Mac.
Hello. Welcome to From the Biblical Files of Dr. Mac. I am Dr. Mac. Today we are going to continue our series of Women in the Bible. Our particular topic today is the plight of the captive women in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, why am I talking about that? Well, as we close out the book of Numbers, there were questions, and there are always questions. The one question that is prevalent is, why did Moses order female virgins to be kept alive, but non-virgin females and all males to be killed in Numbers 31, chapter 31, verses 17 and 18? Is it a genocide situation, or was it an issue of sexual slavery? Well, there are so many comments and so many scholars who take a different view. And I know we're going to talk about the book of Deuteronomy, but we need to talk about the source of the captive women first. And let's take a look at some of the questions that have been asked and some of the answers that have been given. All right, let's just see. Does not the Hebrew Bible in verse 18 refer to all female children and women, regardless of age, who had not yet laid with a man? As to the sexual slavery, would that not depend on the intent of the man who was capturing the virgins to use them for whatever reason? Perhaps the future use is house servants, cooks, handmaidens, laundry people, workers in the field. All females had not yet indulged in sexual activity. So some of the answers were the women were going to be incorporated into the Hebrew tribe through marriage to adopt the ways of their husbands. And that makes a lot of sense. The word virgin in this particular concept may refer to any unmarried woman, so therefore she would be eligible for marriage. It becomes not so much an interpretation, but the idea that there's going to be mass murder, there's going to be mass slaughter, there's going to be genocide. So what happens? Why weren't the boys, young boys who were not old enough to serve in military situations? Well, here's one train of thought, that perhaps the adult males constituted a direct physical threat, and their wives might try to avenge them, or have otherwise been corrupted by their wicked ways, which caused the war in the first place. Boys may grow up and try to rebel or avenge their fathers. Girls would pose no such discernible threat to the Israelites. Now, we have to go back and take a look at chapter 25, where this all started, when the Moabites and the Mennonites were causing the Israelites to sin. And without going into the whole situation with the plague, the situation at Baal-Peor, Kazi and Zamir, and Phinehas, who decided to take the action, it is one of those things that we just have to take a look at and know that these young women, these young virgins, are going to be taken in as captive women. So we should go on. Before we just wanted to go back and say, because the Israelites are going to conquer and capture others as they go through. As we're set here poised to go into the promised land. And as we go through and prepare to do that, Moses is going to have to remind them of what they've been through, how they got where they are, and what they're supposed to do when they get there. Basically, I've told you what the book of Deuteronomy is all about. But we are going to find out that there are some general rules for the treatment of human captives that is laid out in the 20th chapter of Deuteronomy, verses 10 through 17. And we start with when you march upon a city, there are rules given. And as you are there as a military person, a man, and you see, quote unquote, a beautiful woman, what do? We know about the spoils of war, and we will definitely define the difference between a prisoner and a captive. It's a subtle difference, and in this particular instance, we want to use the word captive instead of prisoner because their status changes as we go through. Now, our biblical source is the book of Deuteronomy, and the first thing you're going to say, okay, well, who wrote it? Well, it was written by Moses. It's the last of the 5 books. It's the last of the 5 books containing what is commonly known as the books that contain the law of Moses. Now, it is a book that is somewhat difficult to read because, unlike some of the others, it's repetitive. Some of the others, meaning some of the other 4. This one is repetitive. It is a book that has its meaning from meaning words. Therefore, the words in this particular instance has to do with the copy of the law. And that's the title serving as quote unquote the second law. It brings to a close the 5 books that make up the Torah. And it is a retrospective account of Israel's past. This past consists of the Exodus, the Sinai covenant, and the wilderness wandering. And we get a look into Israel's future as they stand poised to enter into the land of Canaan and begin their life as a people there. Now, this is really interesting because they have thus far been coming out of Egypt. They've been sort of nomads, wandering, and although God had promised them this land, they had to get to this point. But now they are poised to become a nation that does anything that other nations will do. You will find as you go through, they will conquer, they will expand, they will take on some bad habits, but this is not going to be where we are now. The book of Deuteronomy consists of 3 long addresses by Moses. Each of these contains narrative, law, and exhortations in varying proportions. In the expansion of the first commandment of Deuteronomy, we're going to go back to Exodus 20, verses 5 through 6, and we're looking at Deuteronomy's 5th chapter, verses 9 through 10. Moses tells the Israelites how to make a success of their life as a people once they are settled in the new land. The choice presented to Israel is to love the Lord and keep his commandments, or to serve other gods. That choice will determine what kind of life they will make for themselves in the land. Whichever choice they make as a people carries consequences, which in Deuteronomic terms, there are blessings and there are curses. Thus, the book can be seen as a kind of survival manual for Israel and their people, how to live, what to avoid, which gives the book a style and a tone of a life and death urgency. But there's the one thing they must remember, that Yahweh is first. One defining concern of the book is centralization of worship. As Israel's God is one, so worship must be focused in one place, which the Lord will choose from among your tribes there and make his name dwell therein. Thus, the privileged status of the Jerusalem temple is asserted even now. All other places and all other modes of worship of the God of Israel, that meaning the local shrines, the high places, and under the green tree, are prescribed in this particular book. The book was probably composed over the course of 3 centuries, from the 8th century to the exile and beyond. It bears some relationship to the Book of Law, discovered in the Jerusalem temple around 622 BC during the reign of King Josiah. And that reign is in 2 Kings, 22nd chapter, 8 to 13 verses. It gives evidence of later editing because there are references to the exile, and over it, we find the fall of the northern kingdom Israel and detailed descriptions of the siege, especially echoing the fate the north suffered at the hands of the Assyrian invaders. The book draws the minds of the intended readers back to the time before disastrous mistakes were made and their disastrous effects were felt. And it serves to explain the political and the theological dynamics that led to the destruction of the North, as well as to warn the surviving southern kingdom, Judah, to reform by keeping faith with Israel's covenant Lord. Now you say, why does that have to happen? Well, the people of Israel would stray from what they were taught. The characteristics and highly recognizable language and the theology of Deuteronomy are seen in the editorial comments structuring the works that follow in the Hebrew canon. That would be the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, Samuel 1 and Samuel 2, Kings 1 and Kings 2. Together with Deuteronomy, these present the history of Israel from Moses to the time of the Babylonian exile. This great multi-volume of work is then turned into the history of Israel. The book of Deuteronomy itself is also incorporated into the Torah as its 5th volume. The book presents 3 discourses by Moses. There is the first address found in chapters 1 through chapter 4. There is a second address by Moses that starts with chapter 4, verse 44, and goes to verse 28. And then we talk about the Lord's covenant with Israel and the Deuteronomic Code. And then there's a third address, which chapter 29, verse 1 through 33. And we talk about the death of Moses, which is in chapter 34, verses 1 through 12. Now, it follows the book of Numbers, and Numbers ends, as we said earlier, with Moses and the Israelites in the land of Moab on the east side of the Jordan River, overlooking the land of Canaan. Now, the book picks up the story by recording Moses' final instructions to the Israelites before his death, as he was preparing them for their future, a future in a new land and without him as the human leader. The word Deuteronomy comes from the Greek and a Greek version of the Bible, and it said earlier it means second law or repetition of the law. This is because the book focuses on Moses reaffirming and explaining God's law one final time before his death. Its Hebrew title, meaning these are the words, is taken from the first verse of the book itself. The term second law may be misleading, as it could imply that there was a second set of laws added to those given at Sinai. This is not the case. The book is a restatement of the laws God had given Israel nearly 40 years earlier at Mount Sinai, along with further instructions to the generations about to leave the wilderness. And the book is a a restatement to them to remember. Remember, we'd already lost one generation out there roaming around, and we now have this generation, and they are the ones who will go to the promised land. In this retelling of the law, Moses often applies the law more specifically to a people living in a settled land and not a nomadic group. The people of Israel were about to make a major transition from their nomadic personality to a nation with land, borders, city, and property. A more suitable meaning may be repetition of the law as it reaffirms and restates the Sinai covenant. Now, as we go through and talk about the second law, and we remember the Exodus and the Sinai covenant and the wandering in the wilderness, we have to look at the people who are poised and the laws that are stressed for them. I want to move very quickly to Deuteronomy 21st chapter and 22nd, where we find several laws related to women. Remember, our topic is about the captive women today, and we'll focus on 8 verses basically. In Deuteronomy 21st chapter, verses 10 through 14, we find rules for men who take women as captives of war. In verses 15 through 17 are rules for men who have 2 wives, one who is loved and one who is unloved. And in chapter 22, verses 13 to 30, we have laws that relate to sexual morality. These laws are hard for us to understand in our current culture, and they may be difficult for us to accept them. But God spoke out to the people with regard to the helplessness of women who were captives. In the passage dealing with women taken as captives, God gave permission for a man to marry a captive who delighted him, but first he had to allow her time for mourning. If he changed his mind about wanting to marry her, he could then set her free, but he was not to sell her for money or he was not to mistreat her. The law about the 2 wives was to make sure that the unloved wife was treated fairly and that her sons received the treatment they deserved, and that the son of the loved wife was not given undue preference. Now, there we won't talk about it today, but we get into this whole concept of birthright. With the morality laws, God was protecting the innocent wife who was unjustly accused by her husband. In addition, if a man took advantage of an innocent virgin, the law made sure that the young woman was provided for. One of my favorite commentators refers to Deuteronomy as a book that made equal justice for women. Now, it may have Old Testament standards, but some of them still raise questions. But it is important that we understand and appreciate that God speaks out in defense of innocent women. The author of it, we've already said that it was written by Moses and that it contains 3 sermons on the law delivered by Moses himself. There is no doubt regarding the authorship of the book because in Deuteronomy 31st chapter 9 verse, we read, "So Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel." A few verses down, we also read, "So it was when Moses had completed writing the words of this law in a book, when they were finished," that is in verse 24. The evidence is strong that Moses wrote all 5 of the books, and even as I went through my biblical files, sometimes earlier there may have been criticism or the fact that there is editing, but there's no doubt Moses is the author. The book of Deuteronomy consists of 34 chapters, and though they have been divided in different texts, but we think in terms of them doing this, and they are over 1,000 years old. So essentially, the book contains the farewell words of Moses to the Israelites. Moses' final words can be divided into the following three sermons. Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 4, Moses recounted the history of the covenant God made with the Israelites on Mount Sinai and on his guiding them through the wilderness. In Deuteronomy 5 through 26, Moses gave a detailed review of God's law with strong reminders and warnings for the Israelites to stay faithful to their part of the covenant. And this is truly important. We're going to talk about it again. The Israelites were to stay faithful to their part of the covenant. And the third part, Deuteronomy 27 and 31, Moses recorded a renewal of the covenant with a powerful call for Israel to choose life and blessings by obeying God's law. And throughout the three sermons, Moses constantly used the word today, T-O-D-A-Y. In other words, as in chapter 4, verse 4, and then 40, to emphasize Israel's new beginning and the urgency of his message to their lives at the moment. When was it written? Said a little bit earlier, but we'll confirm that most commentators agreed that it was written around 1404 BC. It's possible that Joshua completed the book and wrote the final chapter shortly after Moses' death, or possibly a year or so later after Israel had conquered much of the land of Canaan. The book provides a review of the laws of God given to the Hebrews prior to their entering the Promised Land. It is important for us to understand that these laws were written for a fallen people. So many are dealing with situations that are less than ideal. Now let's go to our focus chapters here. In the 21st and the 22nd chapter, we find several laws relating to women. Now, we find rules for men who take women as captives of war, and we have to remember that there were morality rules throughout the book of Deuteronomy. For those wives who were loved and unloved, for those children who were stubborn and did not want to obey their parents, for the rapists the laws are now not so much as national laws, but they were more individualized. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do. So God gave permission for a man to marry a captive who delighted him, but first he had to allow her a time of mourning. And if he changed his mind about wanting to marry her, he could set her free. But he was not to sell her for money, nor was he to mistreat her. Now, those are the things you want to keep in mind. Now, with the morality laws, God was protective and protecting the innocent wife who was unjustly accused by her husband. And in addition, if a man took advantage of an innocent virgin, the law made sure that the young woman was provided for. Though we may not understand these Old Testament laws, we can appreciate that God, out of the cruelty that could have existed for women, he made sure that there was a defense in place. Themes. Well, the theme of the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' administration to the Israelites to stay faithful to the covenant they made with God at Mount Sinai. They were to remember and to obey. They were to be faithful. The people of Israel were told to remember their history, as it was important for all nations to learn the lessons from their past. Now, this is something that we'll take up a little bit later, that we must remember the history of our past. Frequently, they were told to diligently hearken to God's commandments and to do them. They were also told that they were to put emphasis in the heart and the feelings of the law, to love God with all their being and their neighbor as their self. Simple but difficult to do. Simple but very difficult to do for the people of Israel. They were reminded of God's faithfulness, His loyalty, and His steadfast love. Now we get into some sub themes. There are guide themes for building us a just society in the promised land, and its commonly title is All in the Family. And the second sub theme, You Are With Whom You Mate, regulating sexual relations in the promised land. Now, the setting we've talked about, that it is on the plain of Moab in the 11th month of the 40th year. And we know what's going on there. Now, here we get to an interesting part where we talk about the characters. There is no one woman character here. Very frustrating. When I went to my Bible, I said there must be a woman, a particular name in the book of, as in all their books, Rachel, Leah, Ruth. There must have been a name. No, there isn't. But we have a scholar who has said that is an interesting plight, and at first glance, there don't seem to be any women in this book. But if we look closely, we will realize that they are there in unexpected texts. The first reference to women appears at the end of chapter 3, verse 19, when the inheritance of land given to the tribes of Gad and Reuben is explained. These tribes have been given a portion of land on the east of Jordan, but before they are allowed to settle in, they are commanded to help the rest of the tribes conquer the land on the western side of the Jordan. Their wives, young children, and livestock, however, can settle into the cities while the men go to war. Here we have the war theme. This command explains why women don't appear frequently in the first few chapters of Deuteronomy. It's not that there weren't women among the Israelites. It's that the beginning of the book is directed at Israelite men, outlining their roles as judges and scouts and soldiers. Now there is a shift in the narrative at the beginning of chapter 5. Suddenly, Moses turns to, quote, all of Israel. That's chapter 5, 1. Moses shares the Ten Commandments with all members of the nation, including the women. They are commanded to listen to them, to learn them, to keep them, and to fulfill them. That's chapter 5, verse 2. They are all identified as those with whom God seals the covenant. We are not here. We who are here, quoting again, we who are here, all of us alive today. That's chapter 5, verse 3. The text concludes, these are the words that God spoke to your entire congregation at the mountain. Chapter 5, verse 19. Here again, the biblical language is inclusive. It emphasizes that God's laws are for the entire congregation, not only the men to whom the first chapters of Deuteronomy were addressed. The opening passage of the next chapter retains that inclusive voice. This is the commandment, the decrees, the ordinances that God commands you. And you here is used in a plural sense to teach in chapter 6, verse 1. The same plural appears again a few verses later in the 6th chapter, 4th verse. It appears again later in that 6th chapter. Actually, in the 6th chapter, the 4th through the 9th verse, we can be understood to address all of Israel, including the women. Each individual must love God with all their heart, their soul, and their means. Teach them to one's children. Recite them at all times and places. Wrap themselves and their homes in them. This intertextual reading makes the exclusion of women, enslaved people, and children from the commandment of Deuteronomy 6, 7, all are scandalous, even more scandalous. When we read Deuteronomy 6 in light of Deuteronomy 5, we see that there is a possibility for understanding the commandment more inclusive. All of Israel, the entire congregation, are to participate in this all encompassing worship. The women in the text aren't named, but they are there if you choose to see them. Now, this is a piece from an assistant professor who wants to make sure we understand that women were included. So when we use the all word today, we are talking about both women and men. Now let's take a look at the vocabulary that we have to use. Were the women captives or were they prisoners? So we have to unravel those two terms. At the heart of the issue is the obligation of each and every member of the community. The laws of society may have been different for the Israelites, but the issues of care, compassion, and concern still apply to us today. So let's take a look at this. Okay? It is important that we don't misuse the terms, and I've chosen to use the word captive today with reference to the women who were obtained during a military excursion. So let's take a look and we will see. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the definition of captive is a person who is held by another person or group or country, especially as a prisoner during war. The definition of a prisoner, on the other hand, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is a person deprived of liberty and kept under involuntary restraint, confinement, or custody, especially one on trial or in prison. So when we talk about captive, we refer to a person that is confined or restrained in a particular place against the will. And that is when we refer to that, it has to do sometimes with the issue of safety and well-being. But when we talk about prisoner, it refers to a person who is confined in a prison or a jail as punishment for a crime they had committed. Remember, these women have committed no crime. They were with their tribe, engaging in their religious worship, but they were overtaken by the Israelis at that time. So prisoners sometimes have limited freedom and are subject to strict rules and regulations that govern their behavior. And these persons are usually kept away from the general population. Now, we want to think about it this way. Animal captivity, when we're talking war and conflict, captivity, criminal justice, when we're talking prisoners. But there are always exceptions to the rule. And as we go through, we can take a look at the effect that it has. Now, where's the conflict in this? Since you don't have, as you normally have, two people or one person in conflict with another. No, the conflict deals with the spoils of war. We want to take a look at an examination of the treatment of the captive women in Deuteronomy, and we are staying with those verses, chapter 21, verses 10 through 14. Now, throughout history, one of the most tragic fates of any woman was to be captured in warfare because the treatment of female prisoners by victorious armies has been nearly uniformly barbaric, savage, barbaric. Nevertheless, the Bible contains within it a remarkable law concerning the treatment of female captives that, if obeyed, would make the army's behavior seem as remarkably civilized, much like the North during the Civil War. One of the notable examples of the army whose advance was largely without rape of women of their defeated enemy. Now, in Deuteronomy 21st chapter, verses 10 through 14, it gives the following command, and I try to refrain from using it several times, but you'll have to remember concerning the treatment of female prisoners of war. When you go out to war against your enemy, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and desire her, and will take her for your wife, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails, and shall put off the clothes of her captivity, remain in your house, and after that you may go into her and lie with her and make her your wife. Now, the biblical text deals with the treatment of the sexually desirable non Jewish woman who was captured in war. It addresses the sexual privileges of the captive, as well as she shall put off the clothes of her captivity, remain in your house, and mourn her father and her mother a full month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. And it shall be, if you have no delight in her, then you shall set her free. But you certainly shall not sell her for money. You shall not treat her brutally, because you have humbled her. Now, let us examine the passage as it says. First, the treatment of the female prisoner of war, presumably unmarried young woman of good virtue, usually a virgin, was very strictly regulated. There was to be self-control, waiting a full month of mourning after returning home before consummating the marriage that was accepted. Now, on the part of the soldier, as well as respect for the young woman who has been captured. Her humanity and dignity was to be fully protected from the beginning, as there was to be no dehumanizing, traumatic treatment of her. Furthermore, there were strict limitations on the behavior of the man who wished for a captive concubine or wife. And we remember from Abraham, concubine simply means lesser wife, usually a second person, not the one that he married first, not the head of the household or any of that. After he had married her, a man could not have such a wife and then sell her later or mistreat her. She was to remain protected by the laws of Israel once she had married. There are a few details that are particular of interest to those of us who like to read. One of them is that she is to remain clothed even when she is taken into captivity. There is to be no sexual exploitation of captive women by the army of God's people. Even the defenseless woman, one who is defeated as an enemy, must retain her dignity. Furthermore, such a young woman is to is to trim her nails, okay, and shave her head and mourn her father and mother for a month. And we'll get further into the shaving the head and trimming the nails. It is unusual, but biblical mourning customs often included the failure to trim one's nails or take care of one's hair. 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 24. And so doing so before the period of mourning was to make this part of the mourning uh, process easier. There's another curious aspect to the shaving of the head of the captive woman mentioned in a slightly different context. 1 Corinthians 11 chapter verses 5 through 6. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shown. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. While this is admittedly a challenging passage and is interpreted several different ways, it suggests that shaving of the head of a woman is connected to dishonor. Now, captive woman's head was to be shaved as a sign of being humble as a concubine of her captor in battle. The shaved head was a recognition of the dishonor suffered by her prisoner of war status. Without additional suffering and trauma being added to that, it was a reminder that the man, as well as such action, himself had to be humble about the beautiful young woman whose hair would have to grow back during the time of their marriage. It should be noted that um, the consummation of the relationship as forming a marriage between the soldier and his captive prisoner of war provided protection for the young woman, presumably of foreign birth, under the biblical law. A man could not sleep with a young woman, even a captive, and then sell her for profit. Now, let's consider that this is a common practice in the antebellum South, where men slept with the slaves, not realizing that they were breaking a biblical law, and they abused and mistreated them, and in many cases sold them for profit. Now, such actions demonstrate that most slave-owning societies, even those composed of nominal Christians, fail to obey the Bible's very strict limitations on the conduct of people with other people. The captive women were clearly considered as human beings, and their treatment was strictly regulated by God's law. Human beings were not to be treated as exploited persons or to be treated as chattel property without concern for their dignity. Now, the biblical way of war encompassed many aspects of warfare that are often misunderstood and totally ignored today. The Bible clearly envisioned a soldier in battle might find a captive young lady beautiful and wish to have a relationship with her, and this law protected the young woman in such a situation from the usual dishonor and mistreatment that falls upon the vulnerable and the helpless in times of warfare where brutality is common. Now, this is often driven by what is called a herd mentality of soldiers during a time of war. Now, the warfare in which the soldier is engaged, we have to remember in this particular time, we're talking about a godly armory, and soldiers who have to control their lust and their passions and not let their baser nature get the better of them. This soldier must remember at all times that even his enemies were human beings and should be treated with dignity, even when those enemies were defenseless and unable to protect themselves. Clearly, such a command reflects very high standards on the conduct of soldiers who were called to war. And it is a clear sign that God's standards was to be applicable to all people, even where there was great hostility present. It is a lesson that we should not forget today. Now, the captive woman can be further discussed and explored as part of a healthy family relationship. Um, and how it had the effect on the individual members of that household as well as on the society slash the community as a whole. And these private matters became public in a sense when they were written and they were to be taught and transferred on. Now, as we go through talking about the captive woman, we have to be reminded that the redemptive work of God's instruction in the lives was all inclusive and it was designed to transform every aspect of the, the Israelis' human experience. We also have to remember that there's good news of the kingdom of God that should affect us as we transform our lives every day. We must also remember and not forget that God acts as a liberator, as a person who offers freedom. Just as the military soldier was to free the captive woman if he no longer desired her or if it were an ill match. Now, going on, we look at um, the fact that there is spousal abuse, there is human trafficking, there are barbaric acts that are caused in war, even in the wartime that we have today. Those things do exist, and they have been documented in the past wars that have gone on. Now, it's uncomfortable to talk about the idea of the captive, but it is interesting, and we have to remember that these technically captive women who became married to the Israeli soldier really was, in essence, a foreign wife. Now, the thing about that is that in most cases, there was quote unquote a love situation, and the woman accepted and became part of the community. She became part of the nation of Israel. Now, I did not say 100%. I said that in many instances, that is the thing that happened. We've talked about not being battered and we've talked about not being sold, but the result was the woman was then free. She was liberated. So God has always been a God of liberation, even in the days of ancient Israel. There's no advocation for the mistreatment of a slave, none whatsoever, because the Bible doesn't see it that way. Um, we have generalized principles being given here in the law, and this is the law that deals with family, and we accept that they are troubling, but we have to remember the time in which they're written. They should not be judged uh, with reference to what, well, what we do today, and much of what we do today would have been better had we stayed with what was there. Now, very quickly, a little word or two about the shaving, the cutting of the nails, the removal of the clothes of captivity. The ancient Israelites were not only concerned with morality, but they were truly concerned with the issue of purity. Now, we are talking about a war and women who are taken from other tribes or clans, and they are quote unquote not pure. Um, in the sense that the Israelites would see. So therefore, sleeping with the virgin um, to make a wife, it became necessary that this ritual of purification and mourning go forth. It became necessary for the quote unquote beautiful woman to adhere to the laws that were being given by Moses, and those laws stayed in existence. David is reportedly to have had 400 children by women who were captive. And these were the boys who marched at the front of his army, but did not actually engage in the actual fighting of the army. God was compassionate and that he allowed the women to mourn for the family for a month. And some of the commentators said this was a way to get rid of the idols that they had worshiped. And it was, and many of them, the commentators believed that the Israelite soldiers seeing the woman with the shorn heads or the nails that are too long or the nails that are too short, depending on where they were, and the clothes of mourning, not the clothes that would be used to tempt a soldier. Um, these were done basically to show the real quote unquote beauty of this woman. Um, what looks like beautiful can be transitory. It doesn't necessarily remain that way. And the issue of purity has to have time to work itself out. So we've talked extensively about purity, and we won't really get into the test of virginity that the priests required for those who were coming into the nation at that time. As we go on through, we have to take a look at some commentary by some well-known persons like Peter Pratt's commentary on this. The regulations the regulations that were central to the maintenance of society and the maintenance of family unity are found within Deuteronomy 21st chapter, verses 10 to 23. If you go and read them, I know some of them may sound a little different, but they should be read and you must try to understand. Now, I have to point out the attitude of the current wife that the military soldier had and the attitude of the captive woman are never mentioned here. It never tells us how they feel about how that wife may feel about him bringing home a war bride. We are never told how the war bride feels about the 30 days. The war bride lived those 30 days in his quarters. She did not live separate and apart because, according to the sages, they wanted the soldier to see how she looked physically. Where was this beauty? And the whole idea is that the beauty, if you're going to take a look at this beautiful captive woman, then you need to take a look of what was inside that attracted you, not what is on the outside. And if you were still attracted at that point, then you could go in to her and lie with her and thus consummate a marriage. Now, there's just so much to tell here that it gets exciting, and there's so much to talk about getting rid of the clothes, the clothes of the captive woman. Um, we have to know that the clothes were designed to be provocative, and in many cases, that whole concept was addressed before the army came in, so that you would tempt them. But once you took her to your house, and those garments were withdrawn, and she was put on the clothes that are for mourning, then you could actually see better who that person was. The tons of questions that arise here from these 8 verses are endless. And you look at them and you say, okay, were they better off or are the captive women of today's war? And we have war around the globe, almost every front. And we hear about the barbaric actions that are being done. Are they better now or worse now? Well, we have to say in many cases they are not. God was in the plan here. God was guarding against evil that could have been committed by the Israeli soldier who saw the beautiful woman and wanted her. We have the laws that punish the guilty. The military wars that were fought by the Egyptians, some were mandated, and others were for the purpose of expansion or to make sure that what happened in Moab was not done again, was not done again. So there were sanctions against raping women who were captive, and that was because there was an outlet. There's a law regarding those who rape and how that had to be handled. If we are to look at this, the customs of war rape and the taking of captive women, and we'll notice that none of it was done primarily for sexual purposes. It was done to grow the nation, and we are looking for a mutual agreement between the man and the woman. That's why it's said when he goes into her, and if it does not work, she is to be set free. It becomes a mutual agreement, um, and it becomes a lasting agreement. He's not forced to keep her. He's not allowed to sell her. She doesn't become a slave in any way. In no way is she to be treated as a slave. What are we to learn from here? Well, God had a plan for humanity from beginning to end. The purification rites that are given in Leviticus 14, chapter 8, verse, and Numbers 8, chapter 7, verse, were done to save the nation of Israel at the time as they moved forward, as they moved into the new land. And it was to remind the people that God's image is even in the captive woman. That image is there, and the people are to understand and adhere to that. We are to understand that the safety and the honor of even our enemies have already been designed and taken care of by God. We have precious blessings that are given to us. Um, we have to remember that we are noble and that God does not condone evilness, and that we should try to sustain and understand a loving creative power that is shown even in the laws of Moses, which may be harsh by today's standards. There is liberty, there is love, and there is future hope, which is what we need so much today. It is what we need to have today. And that marriage, whether it's by captive or by non captive, an Israelite, had duties as well as enjoyment. Uh, all of the things that we're talking about are things that have rules. Regarding the women of Deuteronomy, we have to remember that according to their lives and according to the word that is given, women come in all shapes and sizes and complexions and appearances, but they were not to be raped or to be treated illy. That even though we have our current persons who are feminists or right or left or whatever, they are still God's children and they are to be treated as God's children. And if we have a legacy to talk about, we need to go to the book of Deuteronomy and move on to the New Testament and see how God used some of the stories that are here. I thank you for joining us today. And next week we will go into the book of Joshua. Thank you.